Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And a special welcome to our good friend Harley Schlanger joining us once again from Potsdam, Germany for our bi-weekly roundup. And Harley, lots going on. I have had the pleasure of watching your early morning show this morning, Stop the War Machine. So let's start from there. How are you, and how are we going to go about this task?
Well, I have to say, I wake up each morning anticipating more bad news because you see what's happening with the United States and its closest ally, so-called Britain, that they're moving aggressively toward World War III. You know, the fact that they're continuing to give an open path for Israel. They're now bombing in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and threatening Iran. Even as Biden is saying, we don't want to have an expanded war. If you don't want to have an expanded war, then have a talk, have a negotiation. Don't send bombers and missiles. And so you see the degree to which the delusional attitude of the Western military, industrial, financial complex is shaping the policy. And of course, whether Biden is totally supportive of it or not, he's going to go along with it. And so on the one side, there's a bit of angst and horror almost every morning when you dig into the news here in Europe and see what's happened in the last 24 hours. On the other side, there's a growing recognition all over the world of this insanity. I'll just reference two examples. This was in the update this morning, but the editor of the Sunday Telegraph. You don't get more British establishment than the Daily Telegraph. But this character named Alistair Heath wrote an editorial titled, "Europe is Finished." And he said, the rot is too far gone, the decline too pronounced. The Europeans are deluded. They're destroying Europe with self-inflicted pathologies, their third-rate elites, and so on. I think that's an absolutely accurate description. I'm not sure what his solution is. But then we also saw the global times in China. NATO is pushing the Russia-Ukraine conflict towards a world war. And they quote Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, who said, today it's Ukraine, tomorrow it might be Taiwan. So what we've done, and this is something that's available on the LaRouche Organization website, is we put out a statement referring back to the line that came out of the Nuremberg tribunals, that the Nazis who were tried either knew or should have known that there was genocide being committed. And so our statement is titled, Know or Should Have Known. Governments complicit in genocide will not be able to plead ignorance at the coming Nuremberg tribunal. So that's what I'm up to. That's what the LaRouche Organization is up to. The potential to take power away from the establishment is real. Whether it's going to happen or not largely depends on whether all the people who are upset will do something about it. And one of the things you can do is download our leaflet, circulate it, and follow up the marching orders that we gave.
Thank you. And the name of the website exactly is what?
The LaRouche Organization. LaRouche organization.
Is it .com?
Yeah. And okay. I'm not sure it's been posted yet. I know it was written in our internal briefing this morning. If it's not posted, it'll be there soon.
Well, I saw it on Twitter, so it's making the rounds. I just want to make sure everyone can get a copy of it and pass it around, because one of your other messages this morning is that it's time for everybody to take part in this. It's not possible that we can rely on the leaders, no matter how much we like a particular personality that's in the news. The job is ours as citizens. How do you see us carrying that forward?
Well, of course, the people who say they're committed to the Constitution, that they're patriots, it's not enough just to say that. It does require action. The founding fathers wrote a constitution which gave the power to the people to act through their legislative representatives. And the legislatures shouldn't be a permanent position, but should be people who have demonstrated that they're committed to act in the interests of the population and that they're willing to listen and discuss and debate. Now, that's the potential that we have. The problem is that people tend to choose one leader or another, and someone who they think will do what they want or has their interests at stake, but then they throw out their internal perception. They go by certain kinds of intuitive decisions, or else worse, they're just labels: partisan Republicans, partisan Democrats. And the reason it's time now is because, as I mentioned, just these two examples, there's many more I could give of people who are saying we're at the end moment of the republic in the United States. You look at what's happening on the border in Eagle Pass, Texas now, where, whether people are aware of it or not, there is an immigration problem. The Biden administration is doing nothing to address it. But the response of the governor of Texas to send National Guard and put up razor wire and rotted ship vessel containers to block immigrants, that's not going to solve the problem. The problem is the policy of the West toward the poorer countries in the world, which includes war, which includes International Monetary Fund austerity policies, cutoff of credit, sanctions. All these things create in those countries a growing poverty and sense of helplessness, which leads people to risk their lives to try to get to a better place. So it shouldn't be surprising that people want to cross the Rio Grande to come to the United States, to Texas, to Arizona. It shouldn't be surprising that people try to cross the Mediterranean or the English Channel. What are they looking for? Some form of security, some form of hope. Now, instead of condemning them, we ought to look at what's causing them to leave, namely the wars that are being initiated by the NATO countries and the economic policies that are initiated by the financial institutions. That's what should change. And so if someone thinks that voting for Donald Trump or voting for Marine Le Pen or kicking out Sunak in England or Schultz in Germany, if that's going to change something, you have to ask yourself, what is the opposition going to do about the problem? And with the exception of what we're talking about, and with the exception of what's being initiated by the Chinese, the Russians, the Brazilians, the Indians, the BRICS countries, where they're actually investing in infrastructure and development, if that's not the policy, then the West is going to die, because we're killing ourselves with these delusions.
And what I just flashed onto was the old Horace Rowan Gaither statement, the former head of the Ford Foundation, who said that what we have to do is to lower the standard of living of Americans to match that of the Soviets, and to raise that of the Soviets to match that of the Americans. And to me, that was a secret policy back. That's what the Cold War was really about. And now we're facing that. It doesn't look like a victory to me for anybody that has a stake here in America. And in fact, as the BRICS unify and get stronger and have more and more financial power, it looks kind of bleak for the average American. Would you agree?
Well, it's bleak in the sense that we're under a blanket of disinformation, so that we don't really know how bad things are. We've seen inflation come down a little bit in terms of the numbers, but have your grocery prices dropped back? Have your restaurant food prices dropped back? Gas prices dropped back? No. And so, Biden's sitting there saying, why don't people recognize the great job I've done? Then on the other hand, you have the Trump advocates who are saying, well, look what a great job Trump did. Well, in fact, what Trump actually did was push the problems down the road, because he didn't solve the profound economic crisis. What had an appearance of economic recovery under Trump was the bailout policies beginning in 2019, 2020, with the repo crisis, where the Fed committed another $20 trillion to bail out bankrupt corporations. That's a big part of what triggered the inflation, that plus the effects of the lockdowns during COVID. So none of the leading candidates, Trump or Biden, actually has a solution. Trump says we want to go back to where we were. Well, does that mean more bailouts? Does that mean more pumping by the Federal Reserve of worthless dollars into the economy? And that's the big debate economically in the United States, is when will the interest rates start coming down? Well, they're going to start coming down at the point at which they conclude that the population doesn't believe in the so-called Biden economic recovery. So they're going to just pour money in, which is going to have an appearance of economic development, but it's not. So we need a profound shift in the thinking about economics. And what that means is taking on the military, industrial, financial complex, which is the corporate cartels of the defense sector, of the financial sector, of big pharma, of the grain cartels, the social media and media cartels. We're run by cartels. And, although I don't like Teddy Roosevelt, I think he was given a lot of hype by historians for his so-called trust busting. We need a trust buster right now. We need to break up the monopolies that are really at the core of the problem, because if you have a monopoly over credit and a monopoly over food production, over pharmaceutical production, over raw material prices and so on, you can control a country. And that's who controls the country right now.
And of course, control of credit is the famous statement from Nathan Meyer Rothschild from the 1830s or so. And if you look into the Rothschild's history, they've printed a book called the Red Knights or something like that. It's a 1870 or 80 book, and it looks back on the Nathan Meyer Rothschild era. And it describes him as being an absolute scheming, conniving, backstabbing, you name it. But they call that success. Look at what our great founding Rothschild did, and he stabs this people in the back, and he rips off these guys, and he goes and spreads false rumors, and then he cashes in on it, and everybody says, "Wow, you're a genius." and that kind of financial system, not so obvious, but exactly is the problem. And I haven't seen it for decades. A long time ago, I bought William Greider's book, Secrets of the Federal Reserve, and tried to read it. I couldn't understand it. I didn't know what the heck this economics was, or what are they talking about. I didn't understand banking. Nobody understands banking. We might think we do. But, 99% of us just put money in the bank and expect that we're going to get it out someday and it's going to be taken care of. And that's all we need to know. But boy, the machinations of finance behind the scenes that have been, they can make wars happen. They can make peace happen. They can time things right down to the 11th day of the 11th hour. It's amazing what they can do. And unless the American people and others see it, it's just going to keep on.
John, I think if you read Greider's book today, I don't know how long ago you read it, but I think you'd have a better appreciation, because the main thing that comes across is that it's like a private brotherhood of private bankers who control an institution. And while the mechanics change, and they have changed a lot, what they call financial instruments that are traded today would not have been accepted even at the time of Meyer Rothschild and the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913. And to some extent, this is what FDR attacked when he essentially called for the cleaning out of the temple. What was he talking about? He was talking about the financial elite that controlled credit. And at that time, it included the Lazards, which was a branch of the Rothschilds. It included the Rockefellers, the Mellons, the Morgans, the American financial interests that took their lead from the British. And the British, Rothschild, despite the fact that the family was from Germany, became a British banking family, still is. But people make too much of the Rothschilds per se. That it's an interesting aspect of the problem. But the Rothschilds were allowed to do what they did because they had the backing of a European oligarchy. And some of those oligarchs who used the Rothschilds, and they used the Fuggers, and they used several other banking networks, the House of Barty and so on, they used the Rothschilds because they figured Jews are not against usury and real Christians are against usury. So let's hire a Jew to run our financial system. But the Rothschilds didn't control it. It was controlled by this oligarchy, which brought the Rothschilds in. But it's the oligarchy today typified by the City of London and the 5 to 7 too big to fail banks in the United States that control the New York Federal Reserve. And that's where you have to look if you want to look at the speculative casino economy derivatives, for example. I mean, I wrote a lot about this in the 1980s because I was somewhat intrigued by the role of Michael Milken and Drexel Burnham Lambert. And Drexel Burnham Lambert was sort of a spin-off from the Rothschild networks. But what did they do? They invented new financial instruments in a way of figuring out how to launder money into the system to give their chosen operatives power to take over through mergers and leverage buyouts, long-time blue ribbon corporations. So Milken had a group that was called Milken Monsters, Meshulam Riklis, the name is Perlman. There were a whole bunch of these guys who essentially were part of the Meyer-Lansky organized crime networks. So they, in some cases, they were one generation removed from that. In other cases, they just changed their gangster suits for London tweed. But they took this money, this organized crime money, laundered it through Drexel Burnham. And so Milken issued junk bonds where he had the money come in to back up the junk bonds, which could then take over companies. And so you had people like Ronald Perlman is another one of these guys who took over Revlon. He took over a couple of other large corporations using laundered organized crime money. And this blew up in 1987. Remember the 87 stock market crash when Greenspan had just come in? What was going on at that point is that it was still working, these buyouts were working through cash. So when the RJR Nabisco takeover took place in 1986, which I think was 23 or 28 billion, something like that, it took several days to get the cash pulled together and nearly shut down the banking system while they were doing that to allow the takeover to take place. So they said, look, we need a way to get away from cash and cash instruments. And so that's when they started setting up derivatives. And a derivative is a typical example of a fraud. It means an instrument that's derived from something of value but has no value intrinsic to itself. And you start buying and selling these things and you think, wow, here's $1 billion here, $1 billion there, 10 billion here. Someone's making a lot of money. What they're doing is they're creating debt, which is being backed up by the Federal Reserve, because when they can't cover the debt, the Fed has to deal with the problem of, is it too big to fail or should we let it fail? And this is what blew up in 2008 with Lehman Brothers. They all got together and they said, the system's out of control. We've got to bring it back under control. So we're going to have someone be the scapegoat. And we're not going to bail out Lehman. We're going to let Lehman go under. And the CEO of Lehman at the time famously remarked at this meeting at the New York Fed, when he was told they were going to let him go bankrupt, he said, so now I'm the schmuck? And it turned out he was. But when Lehman went, it nearly triggered the collapse of the whole system. So what did they come up with? They came up with the bailout. And this is what Hank Paulson did. This is what Bush signed on to. This is what Obama signed on to. And it was a way to, through TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Plan. They have all these crazy acronyms. But what was TARP? It was a Federal Reserve bailout. They gave American International Insurance hundreds of billions of dollars to avoid bankruptcy. As Neil Barofsky, who is the head of TARP, wrote a book about this, he said it was $27 trillion, both in terms of new debt and future payments that were agreed to under TARP to prevent the system from collapsing. So that's the system that we have. Now, again, it almost blew out in 2019, 2020. And this is when Trump was in there. And he didn't do anything to stop it. They had the repo crisis. And because it was an election year, they basically told him, and repo basically means repurchase, that corporations that can't pay the debt that's coming due have to go to the major banks to borrow overnight. And they put up some kind of collateral overnight for money to cover the debt, but they're supposed to pay it back within 24 to 48 hours. They couldn't do it. The banks stopped lending. And so what happened then? Well, they came up with another one of these clever ideas, which was to have the Federal Reserve take over for the banks. So JP Morgan Chase and others, which were making nice money on repos, got out of the business. And so the Fed just started creating another $20 trillion to get us through the early 2020s. So that's the system we have. And it's a Ponzi scheme on top of a Ponzi scheme on top of a Ponzi scheme. And at some point, it's going to come due. And meanwhile, who's been paying for this? The poorer countries of the world through the looting process that goes on with the International Monetary Fund. And now increasingly, the people in Western Europe and the United States are being hit with this. And it's going to get worse unless we change it.
Lehman Brothers, of course, the history of that it goes back to the southern cotton factors and the huge profits that were to be made by dealing with, guess who, Great Britain. And you know, okay, a little bit of Fraudenschreude there, but I mean, Schadenfreude, sorry, in letting Lehman Brothers go and things like that. All they're doing though is just reshuffling the deck. It's the same deck and it's the same paper that they're shuffling around. And why you know, the willingness of Americans to support this amount of money is just, I mean, it's as if everybody has been completely drugged into oblivion. What the hell are we doing, you know, printing money when we're already in debt by $30 trillion? I can't see anybody. How can anybody not see there's a problem here?
Well, you know, Phil Graham used to have this statement. He said that a family sitting around the dinner table at night knows how much money they have, at least the mother and father do, how much money they have and how much debt they can take on. And they'll make rational decisions around that. Now, that's not entirely true, because if that were true, maybe they wouldn't have gotten a mortgage. Maybe they wouldn't have bought a new car. Maybe they wouldn't have bought some cruises or something. You know, that people do make irrational decisions based on the idea that ultimately they won't be held to account, or if they are held to account, there's a way out. And so you have, LaRouche wrote a paper once called The Future of an Illusion. And he talked in it about what happens when you keep kicking the can down the road. And this is what led to the crash of 1929 through 1931. The banking system didn't crash until 32, really. The stock market crashed, and it took a little while longer for the banking system to crash. You know, today we're kicking the can down the road, and we're promised that there'll be some new source of wealth coming at some point in the future. And the promise is so transparently fraudulent. The idea that the transition to the green economy is going to provide enough cheap electricity, enough cheap energy, enough clean air, jobs, and so on. It's a fraud. And we're seeing that here. Look at in Germany. You want to talk about delusion. The German economy was the strongest economy in Europe up through about 2-3 years ago, by far. because it was an economy based on engineering, on manufacturing, on science and technology, and on a credit system where money went to the producers. But increasingly, Germany was put under pressure by the European Union to change its reserve currency ratios and things of that sort. Deutsche Bank went way out on a limb. Deutsche Bank was one of the leading derivative banks in Europe. And Deutsche Bank should have been put into bankruptcy about 4 or 5 years ago. Instead, Merkel kept bailing it out. And so now you have the whole German banking system, which was resting on this productive industrial infrastructure. That industry is collapsing. They're dismantling the auto sector. The trains don't run very well in Germany anymore. There used to be the joke that trains are on time. Well, they're not on time anymore. The rail is old. It needs to be replaced, the track. There's a nationwide strike of Deutsche Bahn, the German national train service. So they've looted this system for what? For the European Union and for the war in Ukraine. And 20% of Germany's budget next year is going to end up either going to Ukraine or into defense spending. And the German defense minister is saying, we must become war ready because we think we may be at war with Russia within 3 years. Now, that's the talk in all of Europe. That's what the NATO Admiral Bauer, the head of NATO armed forces, is saying. It was a good thing that Sweden had a run on flashlights and emergency supplies because they were at least recognizing that they're about to get attacked. Putin is not crazy. Putin's not going to attack NATO. He never intended. His war was not against NATO. He was pleading with NATO to do something about the Ukrainian attacks on the Russian ethnic population in the Donbass. And not only was he ignored, but NATO started arming the Ukrainians to go against Russia. So this idea that the Russians are waiting for Biden to stop sending money to Ukraine so that they can overrun Western Europe, it's a fairy tale. And yet you watch these people who are supposed to be serious figures like Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, who's an example of nepotism. His father was a fairly decent diplomat. And then Stoltenberg gets in there, and he's just a wet rag for Ursula von der Leyen, who goes back to an oligarchical family. Her husband is from one of the old families of Germany. So you look at what's happening here, and what's reality. The farmers are marching and driving tractors through every city in Germany. Over 100,000 tractors have been involved in tractorcades. And they're saying they're not just doing this for farm income, they're doing it so people will have food. Now you have the restaurants and other craftsmen joining them. And we could end up with a general strike sometime later this month. And why? Because the government is insisting on moving ahead with the green policies in agriculture, the green policies in energy, and the deindustrialization. And the Habeck, who's the economics minister, was asked about this the other day, and he said, well, look, times are tough. The whole world's going through change. Well, no. Much of the world is going through the opposite. They're investing in the future, in real technology, in science, and industry, and manufacturing, while Germany's moving toward a deindustrialized rust heap. So, if it weren't for the danger of expanding war, you could just sit back and say, well, sooner or later the West is going to collapse, and then hopefully Putin and Xi Jinping and the rest of the world will have mercy on us. But we're losing that possibility by going to war with everybody. So that's why it's so important that we put out this statement that said that the people making these policies know or should have known that they're supporting genocide in Gaza. They're supporting a move toward world war with the other attacks they're making. And they better pull back from it if we're going to survive as a human race.
Ukraine, man. The carnage is just unbelievable. It's worse than the American Civil War when you look at the amount of casualties in the same amount of time, and it's just not stopping. And the way that they are willing to just throw bodies into the meat grinder is so disheartening. And why indeed? Other than because it's the will of some oligarch behind the scenes pulling the strings. It's a horrific thing, and yet Europe is 100% behind it. If you look at the governments, it's 100% behind it. Even with Maloney, even and especially with the so-called European Union, and what why is it simply the matter that the United States still runs Europe? Ever since World War II, I mean, and it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because there were the Morgenthau Plan, which you recall was Roosevelt, and we're going to turn it into a gentle pastoral farmland, and they'll never be industrialized again. I'm talking about Germany. That was the American policy for
Well, John, Roosevelt didn't fully endorse the Morgenthau Plan.
Right.
Roosevelt said, no, if you do that, you're going to have the rise of another Hitler. And Roosevelt was smart enough to realize that if you penalize the nations you defeat in war, you just add to the danger in the future. And what happened is when Roosevelt died, there was still a fight, but there were some Germans like Adenauer, like Ludwig Erhard, who understood the American system of economics, the fact that you need a credit institution that's not based on making the owners of the capital wealthy, but actually allows for the country to develop. And that was an institution they set up called the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, basically a credit for development bank. And so they took the money from the Marshall Plan, which wasn't that much, but they used it as the seed capital to create credit that went to industrial projects, and especially engineering, research, and development. And that was the German economic miracle. And that was the dominant factor in Germany. Germans were looked at as industrious, as hardworking, productive, problem solving. And now you look around the country and you see a nation of depressed people. And you look at the leaders in Germany today. I mean, Helga Zeppler-Rouge, who was always fairly tough against Angela Merkel, she said, who would have ever thought we would be nostalgic for the days of Merkel? But you look at Chancellor Scholz, and I guess you could say that the moment that really defines this complete collapse in Germany was the fact that Scholz didn't push back when Biden said, we're going to stop the Nord Stream pipeline. You can count on it. We'll do it. Scholz didn't push back. And then after the pipeline blew up, they never investigated. Just in the last 24 hours, the Swedish government announced they're going to give up their investigation as to what happened with the Nord Stream pipeline. They know what happened to it. They just had the condition for getting into NATO was they keep their mouths shut. So when you ask, how does this happen? It's American money. Some of it is long-term goodwill, because when Europe was in danger from Stalin and the Soviet Union, the United States did step up. There was the Berlin airlift. There were the deployment of troops into NATO, military hardware. But there was always in Europe a hope that there would be something more than just a military standoff. And you had the Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt, the attempt to convince the United States to have rapprochement with Russia, which is what Kennedy was trying to do when he was killed. But the problem was the sense that America and the British system were one and the same. Because after Kennedy's death, the United States essentially came under the control of an oligarchy that was oriented toward the City of London. Now you look at the government today, people like Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, who's clueless in Germany. She has a degree from the London School of Economics. The think tanks in Germany are all integrated with Chatham House, with the Henry Jackson Society, which is a British institution. And by the way, the Henry Jackson Society is also very close to Steve Bannon, because the British have a real hold on U.S. institutions, the Heritage Foundation and institutions like that, the Council on Foreign Relations. So what happened is the British were farsighted. They knew that sometime in the 50s, 60s, 70s, their military power had ebbed, their industrial power had been lost. They lost the ability to loot the empire when India broke free. So what did they do? They took over the institutions that made the policies, the so-called think tanks, the universities. And so we had people like Kissinger and Brzezinski, who were trained by British geopoliticians. In the case of those two, William Yandell Elliott was a key figure. And this is what Carol Quigley is writing about. The open conspiracy is what? How Britain got the United States to be the dumb giant on a British leash. So that's the problem, and it's even worse in Europe, because in the United States there are still people who recognize that sovereignty, a sovereign America, a constitutional republic, is the only way the United States can work. But the problem is they're being hoodwinked by the so-called America First networks. And there's some things that Trump did and said that were really right and important. But the direction that it's going right now, I think, is a very bad direction, because it's just a reaction formation to what Biden's doing. But in reality, you look at the two wars going on now. Trump and the MAGA Republicans are against funding Ukraine, which is good, but they're gung-ho for supporting Israel and going after the so-called Islamic terrorists. They've forgotten what Trump knew in 2019, 2020, that Michael Flynn told him, which is that the United States was supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The networks we're attacking in Syria and Iraq, the so-called Iranian militias, they're the ones who are fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which have been protected by the United States. So, this is a flip. And for some reason, Trump either doesn't see it or doesn't want to talk about it. I heard Kellyanne Conway the other day say that Mike Pompeo might make a good vice president. This is where you see the delusion in both parties.
And as far as Israel is concerned, that brings up another topic I wanted to get back to, because the last time we spoke, you mentioned we were talking a good bit about Zionism, and you mentioned the right-wing American Zionism as being a huge influence. And just from what you just said, with Trump having adopted a very, very strongly pro-Israel position, which I can think he's had, I don't think it's inconsistent with his past, really, that these people are the core of the MAGA movement. And the ones that are most likely to see the Bible as a literal, prescription for the future are his base. And so that really fits really nicely with his attempt to regain the presidency. And I think, he can't go against that. If he were to start supporting the Palestinians, I think he would lose so much support that it would take him out of the race. My opinion.
I'm not so sure. I mean, if you look at what's happening to Biden now, Biden is losing the support of young people, including young American Jews, who are opposing the U.S. support for Israel. And, this is, how powerful a hold does the so-called Zionist lobby have on the American voter? Well, some of it, what you just mentioned, is important. The fact that very clever Israeli psychologists did everything to develop this relationship with the so-called Christian fundamentalists on the idea that the Bible is the literal blueprint for the Middle East, and that the Jews were promised by God basically a real estate contract that goes from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, even possibly from the Nile to the Tigris and Euphrates, because that's what the greater Israel fanatics believe. Now, there are some extremely interesting authors who are, there's one I just have read a couple books by, Avi Shlaim, who was an Iraqi Jew who moved to Israel after 1951 and then became a professor at Oxford, and he's written several excellent books on the fact that the Zionist movement became a colonial settlers movement, especially after 1967, but that it had that tendency going back to 1948. And where did it come from? The British, the Balfour Declaration, the Sykes-Picot Treaty, the British Mandate of Palestine from 1922 to 1948. It was all a setup. And was it because the British loved the Jews so much they wanted to give them a homeland? No, the British didn't love the Jews. They helped create Zionism as a secular movement to carry out British geopolitical doctrine of a divide and conquer in the region of Southwest Asia. So that's what we're dealing with. And I'd really encourage anyone, there's a book called The Iron Wall by Avi Shlaim, Shlaim, which is a brilliant expose of the background of the Netanyahu movement. And you have Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's Netanyahu's national security advisor, who said, yes, Israel is going to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza, and we are going to settle it, and we're going to make it part of greater Israel. And so this is, it's an excellent book, written quite a while ago. And so the truth is there, you can find it. But how many people read these books? How many people study the comments coming from people like the late Rabbi David Hartman and his Shalom Hartman Institute, which is part of what used to be the core of the Israeli peace movement? What happened to the Israeli peace movement that was moving last summer to drive Netanyahu out because of his corruption? Well, all you had to do was unleash a terror attack inside Israel. And whether Netanyahu had something to do with the defenses of the Israeli Defense Forces being down so the attack could take place or not, that's what happened. They weren't prepared. And as a result, the Netanyahu was there to take advantage of the Hamas barbarity to maintain his position in office as a wartime president, prime minister. So, if you really unravel this, you find something interesting. Just as in Ukraine, the Ukraine war didn't begin in February 2022, but in the 1990s with the expansion of NATO, the 2014 regime change coup in Ukraine, the constant bombardment of the Donbass by the Ukrainian government, there's a back history. And it wasn't an unprovoked attack by Putin. It was a deliberately provoked attack. Same thing with Israel. It didn't start on October 7th. The occupation has been increasingly brutal on the Palestinians, going back to the refusal of the Israelis to seriously negotiate for establishment of a Palestinian state. Netanyahu's clear on this. He says there should be no Palestinian state. But that's international law. The UN Resolution 242, which has never been repealed, established the idea of a two-state solution. Well, that's never been allowed to take place. So, if people get the real backstory, the history, and again, John, this is what we were talking about before. As you know, when you look at people like the Dulles brothers, when you look at the post-war history, how the country was manipulated into the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on, you look at these things. You look at Vietnam. You look at the last 30 years of permanent war. What you realize is that there is a force in Western governments that's controlled not but for the interests of the security and prosperity of the people, but for the private aggrandizement of a very small elite who use the control of educational institutions, media, think tanks, and so on, and political parties to impose their will. And what's becoming more clear is that they're crazy. They're delusional. They thought they could destroy Russia. Instead, they're destroying Germany. They thought they can outflank China. Instead, they're provoking a crisis which is going to bankrupt a number of US corporations. So, I think the question is, will there be accountability? And just one quick note on this. The ruling of the International Court of Justice, which some people were disappointed in because they didn't come out and say Israel committed genocide. What they said is there's enough evidence that genocide may be ongoing that we issued these provisional measures to stop genocide from occurring. And that's the 6 points that the International Court of Justice laid down. Now, if the United States believes in a rules-based order, those are some rules that are founded on principles of international law that go back to the Genocide Convention of 1948 that came out of the Nuremberg tribunals in the post-war period. That's something that might be a rules-based order. What is Blinken's rules-based order? It's you do what we say or we have a right to attack you and overthrow you. So this hypocrisy is now seen by virtually every country in the world and increasingly by people in the United States and Europe. So the question is that you raised when we first came on today, why are we so complacent in the face of these dangers that are coming from an unhinged, greedy, parasitical establishment? When will we get out into the streets in large enough numbers to stop this? And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to provoke people to recognize that the Nuremberg Tribunal was not just about Nazis in Germany in the 30s and 40s, but Nazis who remained in power, or at least a Nazi mentality of a survival of the fittest, of an elitist bloodline, and so on. And that's what the fight is about.
Well, that's where I wanted to go back to Franklin Roosevelt, because I think, when you talk about bringing Konrad Adenauer and rebuilding the economy of Germany, I don't think that was Franklin Roosevelt's plan. He demanded unconditional surrender.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Sullivan and Cromwell. Well, this was the Dulles brothers, and Allen Dulles almost personally made sure that didn't happen by making a deal with General Wolfe in Operation Sunrise. And so Franklin Roosevelt was undercut. Whether he would have, I don't think he would have supported Morgenthau's plan either, but the alternative with bringing in all of that, the Marshall Plan and all, was simply cooperating with the old industrialists of I.G. Farben, the ones that they kind of slapped on the wrist, but they let them keep their money. They had already hidden it in neutral countries all around the world. And so kind of like it just didn't come out the way Roosevelt would have wanted it. I think he would have taken the I.G. Farben people and held them up by the heels and shook all the money out of them before he was done, and then send him to the criminal cases. And I really don't think that our policy in the Cold War was anything other than to control Germany by allowing these Nazis to keep running things.
Well, they put them in charge of the German intelligence services.
Yeah, I mean, Reinhard Gehlen, one of the people I've studied in depth in learning my father's story. They put him in charge, and Adenauer was part of that. Of course, the old deals in Cologne with Ford and all of that is no. I don't think Adenauer is somebody that I can look to as a positive character, just because he's part of that corporate And the other comment I wanted to make about Lazard is, you mentioned Lazard, and I think about, how the Lazard policies have are so well illustrated by the loss of Grand Central Station. And when you think about that magnificent building being turned into what it is, what we have to deal with today, that's a visualization of what Lazard has done all over the place, all around the world, to just and telling us, we don't deserve nice things. We're peasants.
Well, John, remember the other part of Lazard was the Andre Meyer, one of the senior partners who took over the Washington Post.
Yep.
And his daughter, Catherine Meyer Graham, for many years ran the Washington Post. And then it was turned over to Bezos, who's, much more nakedly part of an oligarchy. But let me say this about Adenauer. What Adenauer did do was policies that allowed for the two pillars of German economy, which was investment in infrastructure and also a social welfare policy of granting living wages, of taking care of the retirement. This was the Bismarck policy. Now, Bismarck wasn't the greatest hero either, but he recognized something in the American system which was opposite to class warfare and which allowed for an improving standard of living for a growing part of the population. Now, what was the problem with that? And this is where you see the conflict in Adenauer and what would FDR have done? Well, the problem was that FDR intended to continue an alliance with the Soviet Union after the war. What FDR wanted was a Ostpolitik, a rapprochement, a détente that would continue the wartime alliance with Stalin, not because he supported communism, but because he recognized that the idea of fighting Russia would have been suicidal. And instead, after Roosevelt died, Churchill came in, gave the speech about the Iron Curtain in Fulton, Missouri, played right into the hands of the Dulles brothers. You might say the Dulles brothers used the opening from Churchill for their policies. And then what was the other side of this? Well, if you're in a confrontation with the Soviet Union, you need a strong Germany to protect Europe. And so it was from that standpoint that instead of dismantling what was there of the Nazi networks behind the scenes that supported Hitler because of the money that went to their military industrial complex, you needed that to counter the power of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Now, had Roosevelt lived, we may have seen something different between the US and the Soviet Union. And that may have changed the situation for Germany. But I think before you just condemn Adenauer out of hand, you have to realize these were tough moments when the intention of the British was to use NATO for what purpose? As the first chairman of NATO said, keep the US in Europe, keep the Germans down, and the Soviets out. And that's still the policy of NATO. And so this is where you see, again, the role of the British in shaping American policy. And Blinken is nothing but a lesser example of the Dulles brothers in action. The fact that he's now trying to pretend he's Henry Kissinger going to the Middle East every other week and that he's doing good for humanity, and that the US is saying, oh, we want to get rid of Hamas, but we don't want all the casualties. If you don't want it, then you have to tell Netanyahu no more arms until you get a ceasefire. It now turns out that the critics of Netanyahu in Israel are right, that his policy is not to free the hostages, but if necessary, have them all killed. There's a report today that 26 of the remaining hostages are dead, and maybe they presume maybe another 20, and not necessarily killed by Hamas, but by IDF fire. So, what you see is the absolute hypocrisy and fraud of the policies of the West. And that's why we have this title, that the governments complicit in genocide will not be able to use the excuse that they didn't know.
Well, that new Nuremberg tribunal is. I want to be there. I want to see it, and I'm looking forward to somehow we can get enough. It takes enough people and enough places to change things, and I think we're getting there. Man, it's a slog though, and I know you guys have been working at it a lot longer than I have, but I feel good. I feel like we're making a lot of progress, and the insanity of our current economy is becoming more and more obvious to people, and just throwing all of our wealth into war. Why are we willing to send all of our money over to a war in a country that's 5,000 miles away that we really don't know much about at all? It's all about the financiers and how they keep on getting richer and richer and turning us into serfs that they can just draw money from whenever they feel like it. That's not going to work, I hope.
And John, if you boil it down, what's the Ukraine war right now? It's the future of BlackRock, Vanguard, grain cartels, hoping that Zelensky can stay in power, or the corrupt oligarchs around him, to allow them to loot the country further. And that's the absolute tragedy of people who are flying the gold and blue flags of Ukraine and saying we're fighting for Ukrainian democracy and freedom. The Ukrainian government is not fighting for democracy and freedom. It's fighting to save its rear ends and the money they've pillaged from the U.S. and the European Union. And for even if it's not for the right reasons, I think the Republicans standing against the Biden attempt to give more money to Ukraine is crucial, and they should be getting support for that.
If there's any interest, or I know there's a lot of interest in doing another Rage Against the War Machine, I don't think it's come together this year. Last year's was very inspiring to me, and I know a lot of folks from LaRouche and Schiller were there, along with Libertarian and People's Party and Garland Nixon and a number of celebrities were there. And I hope that something like that can come together. I would do what I could to try to support it. Because there's something about bringing even a few thousand people together that just has an effect. And,
John, just one quick note on that.
Yeah.
One of the people who was instrumental in that was Jose Vega.
Absolutely.
Jose just announced an independent candidacy for Congress in the Bronx, and you can find some material on him on the internet. His campaign was announced on Jimmy Dore's show. So you can see the potential to spread this as part of the International Peace Coalition. So I'd urge people to look up Jose Vega, Vega, and see what you can do to support his campaign.
And I am doing that. And Jose Vega is very active on Twitter, so you'll have no trouble finding him on Twitter. I think he's also on Instagram and other places, but I don't spend much time there. I have invited him and Diane Sayre, and they have accepted to a show on Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time here at McDuff Lives. So I'm looking forward to introducing and reintroducing those two to my audience. That's again is this Monday. Jose Vega, candidate for Congress from the city and state of New York and the Bronx, and Diane Sayre, the Senate candidate from New York, also. I mean, this is great. This is momentum. This is yeah, man. Let's keep going forward. And
new leadership.
Absolutely, that's right. Being a leader and very talented young man, very talented indeed. So. Thanks again, Harley, and thanks to the Schiller and LaRouche organizations for all their great work.
See you in 2 weeks.
All right, my friend. Bye now. And thanks, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.